Welcome back, everybody, to another reaction video. Well, today is what is known around the world as Holocaust Remembrance Day. It's the 76th anniversary of the day that the Soviet Army liberated the Auschwitz concentration and extermination camps in Poland. And so I thought it would be an appropriate day to take on Sabaton History's The Final Solution. We've already done the song, The Final Solution, and talked a little bit about that. I honestly don't expect I'm going to add a whole lot to this one. I think the content will speak for itself, but I will add some thoughts here and there, but I just want to go ahead and dive right into this one.
This episode of Sabaton History is about one of the darkest chapters in human history.
This is the final solution.
It happened on November 9th, 1938. The National Socialist leadership of Germany had gathered in Munich to commemorate the Beer Hall Putsch, Adolf Hitler's failed attempt to grab power 15 years earlier. Then the news arrived that Ernst von Rath had succumbed to his wounds. He was a young German diplomat who had been shot in the German embassy in Paris by Herschel Greenspan, a Polish-German Jew. Joseph Goebbels, German propaganda minister, now addressed the party officials and spoke vividly of a global Jewish conspiracy that aimed to push Germany into a war with France. Outraged, the men rushed to the telephones and urged their local Nazi henchmen to act. What followed was Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, a nationwide pogrom against Jewish communities in Germany. 1,000 synagogues and prayer rooms were vandalized or set on fire. 7,500 shops were wrecked and looted. Jewish neighborhoods were attacked, and 90 Jews were killed. It was the climax of years of anti-Jewish policies and harassment. Adolf Hitler's chancellorship had turned anti-Semitic rhetoric into state policy. Since mid-1935, Jews faced increased harassment. Under Reinhard Heydrich, the German Security Service, SD, began monitoring Jewish organizations and affairs more closely.
So let's talk about Heydrich for a minute, because Heydrich is eventually the guy who is kind of the author or the person who pulled together what was known as the final solution. Heydrich actually starts out as kind of a low-level guy in the Nazi party. He was in the Navy back in the late 1920s, early 1930s, and had a series of relationships with women, and in one case had actually promised to marry one of these women that he had had an affair with. And then when he didn't marry her and got engaged to someone else, this woman that he kind of spurned made a big deal about this, and apparently her father was good friends with the admiral in charge of the German Navy, and got Heydrich thrown out of the Navy because of it. And while he's kind of figuring out what he's going to do next, somehow, and I don't know the details of this, he gets an interview with Heinrich Himmler. And this is the early days. This is even before the Nazis have actually taken power in Germany. And Himmler is so impressed during this meeting with Heydrich that he actually hires him to kind of be the guy who runs the security for what became the SS. So Heydrich kind of almost stumbles into this position under Himmler and then rises quickly to power. And eventually, not long after he authored the final solution and chaired this meeting, which I'm sure they're going to talk about, he actually gets put in charge of Bohemia, which is a part of Czechoslovakia, and there was this elaborate plan to get rid of him, and I think it was actually the British who trained some Czech commandos, dropped them with parachutes into Czechoslovakia, and they eventually were able to assassinate him.
To the Nazis, Judaism was not only totally alien to German culture, but also the natural enemy of National Socialism. Hitler believed in an international Jewry that pulled the strings behind both Soviet Bolshevism and Anglo-Saxon capitalism, and Germany must free itself from their influence once and for all. For the Führer's planned cleansing of the Reich, Heydrich recruited Adolf Eichmann, a former desk worker at Dachau concentration camp. It would be his job to implement these stricter policies aimed at excluding Jews from the German economy and everyday public life.
See, here's one of the things, too. Kristallnacht was this kind of, there was all this build-up tension and years of rhetoric against the Jews and how they were the enemies. It was their fault that Germany lost World War I, and Jews conspired to all the damage that was done to Germany in the aftermath with the Treaty of Versailles, and Jews are responsible for Bolshevism in the Soviet Union and capitalism and all this stuff. All of that was building up, and Kristallnacht kind of was like somebody releasing that valve and them letting off all the steam a little bit. But Hitler and the others in the Nazi leadership wanted this to be done as legally as possible. So they started implementing all these rules in terms of things like genealogy and how they determined who was a Jew and who was not, and then started kind of legally ramping up the pressure. So if I remember right, Hitler was actually kind of upset about Kristallnacht because he didn't want it to be done like that. He didn't want to gain sympathy for them. He wanted it to be done legally.
By making their lives as miserable as possible, they would push the Jews to voluntarily emigrate from the Reich. They were not to feel welcome nor safe in Germany, and public opinion was to be swayed accordingly. Over the following years, Jews were denied entry into theaters, into cinemas, museums, and restaurants. They were banned from using public transportation and even owning bicycles. Shopping was restricted to 1 hour a day, and there was a strict curfew in the evening. And Jews were not allowed to buy certain things like cigars or flowers. They were not allowed to own telephones or typewriters either. They eventually had to wear a yellow badge to visibly differentiate themselves from everyone else, and they paid extra taxes. The Nuremberg racial laws of 1935 were set in place to legally segregate the Jews. Citizenship was restricted to people of German blood. Jews were reduced to mere subjects of the Reich.
And like I said, the idea of German blood then, they were very specific about how they legally defined that. Like if you had one grandparent who was Jewish versus two, and if it was on your mom's side, your dad's side, all of this really complicated. I mean, they took a lot of time to specify all this out. And you can notice this isn't something where Germans, the Nazis came to power and suddenly they started persecuting the Jews. This is like the proverbial, frog in the boiling water, where, you throw a frog in boiling water and he jumps out, but you put him in room temperature water and you slowly turn up the temperature, he doesn't notice and he boils to death. That's what they were doing, is they were slowly turning up the temperature, pushing it a little more and a little more and a little more, to where going that final step and starting to actually mass exterminate them was just the next step in the process as far as they were concerned.
Without political rights, they were fired from the civil service. Teachers and professors were ousted. Jewish-owned shops were attacked. The Hitler Youth Organization chased Jews out of public spaces. The laws were so strictly enforced that even the smallest misconduct could lead to imprisonment or worse. Jews lived under a constant fear of inspections, house searches, and death threats. And then Kristallnacht happened. Hitler, however, was furious at Goebbels about inciting all the violence in the streets. An unregulated mob roaming the streets not only discredited Nazi authority, but also had a sobering effect on the German people. Many bystanders were shocked by the uncontrolled violence and the lawless behavior of the mob. Worse for Hitler, they felt sympathy for the Jews that were manhandled and humiliated by the Nazi Party members.
See, this is something that Hitler was very conscious of. When the Nazis first came to power, up until that point, they had the SA, what was known as the brown shirts under Ernst Röhm, and they were kind of their thugs, their kind of hired guns, so to speak, that had kind of used muscle to get where they were. But once Hitler actually got real legal authority, he understood that being viewed as a bunch of bullies and thugs was actually a negative thing in winning over the rest of the German people. And so that was why they had what was called the Night of the Long Knives, where he kind of eliminated Ernst Röhm and a lot of his other political enemies or people who could become a liability later, because he wanted it all to be as legit as possible. And this is an extension of that.
Hitler actively forbade any such organized pogroms in the future. The Jews, he insisted, were to be expelled from Germany through laws and edicts and detained far from the public eye. Over the next months, Jews who had broken the laws were sent to concentration camps, to Buchenwald, Dachau, and Sachsenhausen, which had previously housed political prisoners and actual criminals. Now the majority of the inmates were Jews. The fate of the Jews was to be tightly bound to Hitler's ambitions. On the road to war, the Fuhrer stylized himself as something of a prophet. In his speeches, he repeatedly warned of international Jewish influence and that if the Jews would steer Germany into another world war, then they would not survive to see its end. It seems like a self-fulfilling prophecy, as by December 1941, Hitler had invaded the Soviet Union and declared war on the United States, but his belief in the international conspiracy remained, and his war became a war against Jewish life itself. On December 20th, 1941, in a villa outside Berlin, the Wannsee Conference began. Prominent Nazi Party members met with officials from the Reich Main Security Office and from the occupied territories. Here, they would decide once and for all how to answer their Jewish question. The discussions were to offer, quote, clarity on questions of principle, and the, quote, preparation of the final solution of the Jewish question in Europe.
So Reinhard Heydrich is in charge of this Wannsee Conference, and this is the one that I mentioned during the music video. There's a powerful movie that I highly recommend anybody who's interested in history that you watch, Conspiracy. It stars Kenneth Branagh, and it's just I think Colin Firth's in it, just Stanley Tucci, all-star cast. I mean, almost every person sitting around that table is a recognizable face that you've seen before in a lot of other movies. And the way that this discussion happens, and you see it unfold, where they have this conversation where they're debating the fate of the lives of millions of people as if they were talking about a bunch of cattle, it's terrifying. It's absolutely terrifying how cold, how calculated, and how easily they do this. And I recognize that it's historical fiction. We don't know exactly what was said in that meeting. We have a pretty good idea of who was there. But I highly, highly recommend it. The acting is phenomenal, and it should just send chills up your spine watching it. It's called Conspiracy. Check it out.
Emigration was not enough anymore. The war had changed Judenpolitik to something far, far more sinister. Authority over the final solution was given to the SS. Its leader, Heinrich Himmler, envisioned first Europe-wide deportations of Jews from the west to the east. Eichmann's office was ordered to prepare the removal of hundreds of thousands of Jews from Germany, Austria, Bohemia, and Moravia to the overcrowded ghettos of Eastern Europe. Since the war began in September 1939, the Jews of Galicia, the Vaterland, and Poland, organized as the Generalgouvernement, had been forced to live in segregated residential districts. But even though they were impoverished and cramped together in appalling living conditions, these Jewish communities survived. The final solution was to deny them even that. SS doctors now came into the ghettos to sort the residents into two categories. The first category was for young and healthy Jews who were able to work for the German war effort. The second was for those that could not, the old, the weak, the sick. These people were to be liquidated. The regular concentration camps had already improvised special treatment programs. That is a euphemism for the outright murder of Jews that could no longer work. Jews that were sent from the Łódź ghetto to the Chełmno camp were herded up a ramp and through a door. Behind that door, they entered the dark back compartment of a gas van. On their drive to a remote location, the men and women were asphyxiated, either with bottled carbon monoxide gas or exhaust fumes piped into the compartment. Once they reached the designated burial ground, a group of Jewish prisoners was ordered to drag the dead from the van into excavated pits. At the end of the day,
they would kill
those
them.
workers had to enter the pit as well and were shot dead.
Imagine, just try. I know it's hard to just even try to wrap your mind around any of this at all, but imagine just how cold and calculating this continues to be. I mean, you force a group of these able-bodied Jews to dig these pits to bury the recently mass murdered fellow Jews of theirs. And then once you've used them for the day, you go ahead and execute them and bury them in the pits that they dug themselves. That's what they're doing here.
The Belzec death camp was the first installation for mass murder on an industrial scale. Belzec was enclosed by fences of barbed wire, watchtowers, and when trains full of Jews arrived, usually an SS officer stood in front of the crowd and reassured them that they would only remain in Belzec for a short time.
He wasn't lying.
They would now have a shower and receive their valuables and other belongings afterwards. Undressed, the men walked first into a long corridor, walled off by barbed wire. Now, it was there that the Ukrainian guards took over from the Germans. Chronic shortages of manpower forced the SS to rely on multitudes of foreign auxiliaries, known as Hivis or Tralniki men. Ukrainians, Belarusians, Lithuanians, Latvians, and Poles were recruited to serve as guards at the extermination camps. Armed with bayonets, clubs, and whips, they broke any resistance with terrifying violence. The gas chambers themselves were crude, simple buildings, 4 by 8 meters long, 2 meters high, with double wooden walls. Essential was the airtight rubber-sealed door, which also had to be strong enough to resist any strong force from within. Several hundred prisoners were pressed into the small space of the gas chamber. Once the door shut behind the crowd, the lethal exhaust fumes from a dismounted Soviet tank engine were piped into the chamber.
Now, the problem as the Nazis saw this was that the carbon monoxide gas from exhausts took too long to kill people, and they couldn't kill them as fast as they were bringing them into the camps. And so I believe it was Rudolf Höss, who was the commandant of Auschwitz, was eventually the one who perfected the idea of using Zyklon B. I think it was a form of cyanide gas because it was able to kill in seconds or minutes at most rather than the long time it was taken. And they got to the place where at maximum strength they could kill 10,000 people a day at the Auschwitz-Birkenau extermination camp.
The men were so tightly packed that when the doors were again opened, the dead stood in an upright position, mouths slightly open, with their hands often pressed against their chests. The women went next, after fellow prisoners came to cut off their hair to be used for industrial purposes. By then, it must have dawned on many of the women what fate awaited them. The SS men also didn't care that the guards raped many of the young girls before sending them into the gas chamber. The dead were buried in large pits concealed from the train station, and Jewish workers tidied up the station platform before the next train arrived. The final solution was a vicious cycle. Ghettos were refilled with Jews from Central Europe as the former inhabitants were sent to either labor camps or condemned to death. Each wave of roundups meant a death sentence for tens of thousands of Jews. As the SS grew in power over civil administration, the classifications changed, and more Jews were marked for death. New extermination camps were built as well: Treblinka, Majdanek, and Sobibor. Treblinka had little of the clean and deceptive murder machine the Nazis first envisioned. The massacres often started right at the train station, as the Jews were alerted to their impending fate by the corpses lying on the ground. The camp simply killed people too fast to hide its purpose. It is estimated that Treblinka killed around 4,600 people a day. That's nearly 200 per hour, every hour. Auschwitz became the last place designated as an extermination camp, though it had been in use since early in the war as a terror camp for Polish officials and dissidents. In July 1942, it was incorporated into the final solution. While Auschwitz I was
Work
to
will
remain
set you free.
mainly a concentration camp for forced labor, a second Auschwitz camp at Birkenau would experiment with new extermination techniques. The first gas chamber there opened in March 1942, and it was outfitted with crematoria for disposing of the corpses of the dead. Once the prisoners were inside the gas chambers, SS men wearing gas masks would remove the covers of the ceiling vents, opening cans of Zyklon B poison. The body heat of the people pressed into the chamber caused the Zyklon B crystals to vaporize, releasing hydrogen cyanide gas. The Jews painfully choked to death on the fumes in minutes, even seconds. Auschwitz was also the place where German doctors experimented with mass sterilization of many Jews that were not destined for immediate extermination.
And this is an important point, too, that a lot of times they did these experiments, and it wasn't necessarily just things like sterilization. You had the notorious people like Dr. Joseph Mengele. They would experiment on things that they thought would help with the war effort. So, for example, there was an issue where German pilots were having to crash land in the North Sea, and they were freezing to death too quickly. And so they were trying to figure out ways that they could keep German pilots from freezing to death so fast. And so they would do experiments where they would strip Jews naked and they would throw them in icy water and see how far along toward death they could get them and then still revive them. They did these horrible experiments on twins where they would do things to one and see how the other one reacted. And, I don't even really want to get into some of the terrible experiments of things that they did, but just things that you can't even imagine, far worse things than just simply exterminating somebody in a gas chamber.
What had begun in 1935 would find its terrible conclusion in that year of 1942. The Nazis envisioned a final solution that would exterminate Jewish life in Europe. And as long as the war was fought, as long as the Nazis remained in power, and as long as the camps remained open, the Jews would suffer and die. The final solution was the darkest chapter in German history, and one of the darkest in our world's history. And the Holocaust is vital to be remembered as both a commemoration for its victims and as a warning to future generations of the depths to which humanity can sink and the atrocities that man can commit against his fellow man if the darkness and the hatred in some human souls is left unchecked and allowed to grow and fester.
And he makes a really good point there. This is not the first or the last time in human history that man's been capable of things like this. We've talked before about what happened to the Chinese people during the Japanese invasion around this same time and even a few years before. There was the Armenian genocide back during World War I that killed millions of Armenians. More recently, in America, well, not more recent, but in America, on a smaller scale, but what was done to many of the former slaves in the years after the American Civil War, the way that they were treated and the mass lynchings that took place. All throughout human history, as he mentioned, when man is given the ability to do this, there are always going to be people who are capable of these things. When there's law and order, we call them serial killers because they operate on their own and they do it outside the law. And we try to catch them and arrest them and punish them. But when the people who have that mindset are given authority, whether military or legal authority, this is the depths to which it can go. And it will always be a part of our history so long as we allow it to be a part of our history.
Per, you've been to Auschwitz. I've never been there. I haven't been there yet, but you guys have been there, yeah?
Yeah, we've been there 2 times with the band stopping by. Obviously, we play a lot of concerts in Krakow, and this is very close to Krakow. It's a place I always recommend our crew members and band members to go and visit. And even though the second time we came there, I choose not to go inside. I think that one time in this place is enough. It leaves you with serious scars after you come out, that's for sure. When we wrote the song, we thought we seen so many documentaries, we read so much about Auschwitz that we thought we could sort of be prepared to what we're gonna face.
Yeah.
I mean, both me and Joachim talked about this so many times afterwards that you can't get prepared for this. because no matter how much you think you know about it, no matter how much you think that you are sort of prepared yourself, you are absolutely zeroed out when you start to walk around there, and when you walk out of there, there's not anything left in you, and that's why the reason is I had no reason to go in there and feel this again. I encourage the other guys to go inside, but I wouldn't go inside myself a second time.
So I've heard a lot of people say similar things, and I think one of the few places they tell people not to take photos or videos is there's the room with all the hair that had been removed from women who had been exterminated either before or after, that was eventually going to be used for things like mattresses, things like that. They have all the shoes. I read somewhere that at its height, the Nazi regime was removing around 10 to 12 kilos a month of gold from the teeth of exterminated people. That's about 25 pounds of gold a month from the teeth of people that they had killed. And those things, seeing a pile of glasses, seeing all the artificial limbs that have been removed, those really illustrate the humanity of this, I guess, in a powerful way that you can't otherwise understand. Seeing the pictures, and I've seen some colorized pictures of some of the victims, is a powerful thing as well.
And just writing this song in the first place, I mean, it is a heavy topic, sure, but it is also a controversial topic. You know there are Holocaust deniers out there. You know there's people out there.
I have no patience for people like that.
Well, when you wrote the song, did you get reception? Did you get critique from?
We get, as there can be sometimes with Sabaton, there can be people who say, oh, you are profiting from this, or you write a song to become popular about this. There are angles that people try to sort of attack the band Sabaton for what we are doing. Again, we are telling history and we are keeping it alive.
Yep.
And we choose, of course, not to see that we are in any way, promoting anything that we are singing about in this terms of, we're just saying this happened. Yeah. But we had a lot of people who got upset when we did this song. Okay. And I think that that people get upset with it shows the power of the topic. Yeah. And in one way, I think that it should just be very clear and not disputed, but it is.
Well, what about, as you said, you're telling the story of what happened. What about people that say, no, it didn't happen? What about them? I mean, they obviously get upset for a completely different reason.
Yeah, they get upset for a different reason, and we have seen a couple of those comments as well. But in the comment section, sometimes this it gets quite nasty when somebody tells like that, and the continuation of the comments is leading often into a sort of war. It's that kind of song.
Okay, well, I personally am glad that you write songs about glad. That's not what I mean, but you know what I mean. I think it's important that you write songs about even the absolute darkest parts of our history. And on that note, I'm going to say goodbye for today. Never forget.
I want to close with a couple of thoughts about all of this. In my role as a speaker for Rachel's Challenge, we share a little bit of the story of Anne Frank. Now, Anne Frank was not any more special than any of the other millions of Jews and the millions of non-Jews who were killed during the Holocaust. But because of her story, I think she brings a face to all of this. And this was a teenage girl who was an incredible young woman who was writing the story of her family and a few other families who were being hidden by people in the Netherlands as they hoped to stay alive. And eventually Anne Frank died along with her sister and her mother. Anne and her sister died at a place called Bergen-Belsen, like 2 weeks before the Allies liberated the camp. And they weren't exterminated. They died from, I think, typhoid fever or typhus. But Anne Frank wrote a quote that I want to leave you with, and I want to ask you to follow. she said, "You can always give something, even if it's only kindness." Here's a girl who was fighting to stay alive, was hiding in the attic of an office building so that people she didn't know wouldn't round her up and execute her just because of who she was. And she was encouraging kindness. So in honor of the millions of people whose lives were lost to what we call the Holocaust, go out and show some kindness to people today. Thanks for watching.